Hello there, my name is Andy Staples and I'm the Director of Research at the Heinrich Foundation based here in Singapore. Delighted to be joined today by colleague and Heinrich Foundation Research Fellow, Alex Capri. Alex is also a Senior Visiting Fellow at the National University of Singapore Business School here. Alex, thanks very much for joining us, and wanted to get you on to have a chat about your new paper that we're just publishing, which is titled Techno-nationalism and Diplomacy. Now, this is the third in a series of papers that you've been writing around this theme. So to get us underway, I wonder if you could just help us review that term, techno-nationalism, and then we can move on to look at this new paper.
Certainly, Andy. So techno-nationalism really is a broad application of a state's attention to its level of technological preparedness or innovation, and how it will equate that to national security issues, its economic competitiveness in the world with technology in that space, and now increasingly social stability, and how technology is either promoting social stability, or it is destabilizing society.
Mm. You go on to look at diplomacy within this context. Help us to sort of understand that landscape that you're looking at. What are some of the key themes that you explore within the paper?
Mm-hmm. Well, as a backdrop, we have this U.S.-China technology Cold War or hybrid Cold War, and we have this emergence of techno-nationalism as we've just discussed. And we're in early days of techno-nationalism, which means that what we've been seeing is the weaponization of supply chains, for example. So with the U.S. trying to cut off semiconductor technology to Chinese companies like Huawei and Hikvision and now SMIC and others. But those are early days, and that's a very crude sort of blunt instrument, if you will. As techno-nationalism evolves and escalates, the next level will be what I call techno-diplomacy. And that means that you have nations looking to promote their techno-nationalist agenda, but they're using diplomacy or realpolitik, if you will, in different ways to influence, to persuade, to change outcomes, and that is occurring across different levels of international institutions. It's occurring in the media, for example. It's occurring in the different rule frameworks around free trade agreements, and now we see these, this rise of the bilateral agreements between countries that are now looking to address technology issues and standalone rule frameworks.
And just to sort of dig into that in a bit more detail, because you talk a lot about sort of standards and the standards that we're going to be employing for the future, for the digital economy. And that seems to be one of the key battlegrounds in this area.
Yeah, and there are really two different kinds of standards that we're talking about with technology. The first are the actual technical specifications, the bandwidth at which 5G will operate, for example, and sort of the interoperability standards between different elements of technology in, again, for example, the Internet of Things. So that's one level of standards. The other level of standards is how that technology can be used, and those are tethered to ideological values, and the core values that are really at the core of these differences in U.S. and all, if you like, Western liberal democracies versus China, involve the use of technology to either enhance or suppress privacy, or to enhance or suppress freedom of expression, or of course, how technology could be used for surveillance and monitoring, which could impact the other two values. And so we're seeing a divergence there around those standards between what I would call, and what has been called, techno-authoritarianism, which you could ascribe to China, and digital democracy, which you could ascribe to this growing sort of coalescing group of large democracies around the world.
And that I find fascinating, because you talk about the sort of fragmentation of the world along different standards and ideological approaches, but at the same time that is pushing certain groups of countries or individual countries together. And you give the example of the US and Europe apart on some issues around the sort of nature of the digital economy, but then getting much closer together when it comes to their approaches to these type of technologies like AI and so on. Could you give us a bit more detail on that?
Yeah, so we're seeing the emergence of, for example, you have the G7 AI initiative, which are the G7 countries, and a growing list of others that are looking to join. And again, they're saying, look, we will work together to develop AI. We will work together to develop any kind of technology in a way that promotes the values that we believe in. Again, privacy, freedom of expression, and people's right to go about their business without being monitored in every sense. So that then has a spillover effects into trade, for example, into international commerce, because if we're now tethering ideological values to transactions using data, for example, and also transactions in the buying and selling or the use of hard technologies, that's going to have a material impact on which companies can sell to which companies, what kind of equipment can be used or not used, who gets put on a restricted entity list. And these are fundamental to how the world is beginning to fragment, and how, again, we're seeing these sort of coalescing into these different groupings.
Yeah, and just sort of talk for a moment on what the implications of that process is on state and non-state actors, on governments, multinationals.
So I think if you look at multilateral organizations, multilateral institutions, those institutions are going to have to adapt. They're going to have to change to be able to address these challenges. And of course, we're seeing these issues beleaguering the World Trade Organization, right? So, World Trade Organization wasn't built to accommodate digital trade, wasn't built to accommodate the platform economy and these issues that we're discussing. But it's not adapting very well, because you've got the Chinese, who have a completely different view of how data should be used, and then you have these other countries. So that's one example. I think other examples are, you have the Wassenaar Arrangement, which is a treaty amongst 42 countries. Goes back to COCOM during the Cold War era, the U.S.-Soviet Union Cold War. And that was an institution, a treaty that was set up to prevent technology from bleeding over to the Soviet Union and being used for military purposes. So that institution now is sort of reorienting itself, and the U.S. in particular, with its historic allies, are using the Wassenaar Arrangement to essentially prevent dual-use technology, particularly with semiconductors now, from going to restricted entities, such as many of the companies in China, such as Huawei and others. So I think you have that in particular. And then, of course, you have, if you look at, for example, free trade agreements and these big comprehensive multilateral free trade agreements that are now looking to carve out sections specifically dealing with technology standards. And again, you have a distinct difference between a progressive FTA like the CPTPP or any kind of European Union free trade agreement with Singapore, with Japan, with Vietnam, with that are very progressive and deal distinctly with these digital issues around privacy and inclusion and so forth. So even if the large multilateral institutions can't address some of these new standards and these new issues, we will see countries, both state and non-state actors, working together in public-private partnerships to carve out or even to create standalone digital agreements, which we're also seeing with, for example, DIPA here in Asia Pacific, where you have, New Zealand, you have Chile, and you have Singapore, coming together, working on these frameworks. You have supply chain resilience initiatives where you have Japan, India, Singapore, other countries wanting to join, looking at, again, frameworks that specifically address technology standards.
This goes back to some of the earlier themes in your first paper in this series, I think, where you're looking at sort of strategic decoupling, this bifurcation of technology standards and so on. And this is something that you see playing out now and continuing for the future?
Oh, absolutely. And I think going forward, Andy, the next big thing, you mentioned non-state actors and state actors, is this new system of corporate governance that's going to have to emerge for both non-state actors and state actors to be able to gauge what's happening in global value chains, right? That to be able to produce the transparency and the traceability that we need around all these new standards, right? How technology is being used or how it's being abused. And so I think the next big thing going forward for companies and governments will be figuring out how to use technology, how to put in place processes, how to develop the human capital, and how to produce the right kind of rules around corporate governance for technology standards.
Yeah, a lot there for people to be considering. So your paper is certainly going to help them with that. Just turning thoughts to the next paper that you've got in mind. We, as I mentioned, this is a series of 3 so far: strategic decoupling, techno-nationalism, and then this paper looking at techno-nationalism and diplomacy. What's next on the agenda?
Well, I think, again, it's as we get further down this road of techno-diplomacy, and we see the world beginning to really form into these different blocks and coalitions of the willing in many cases, where we don't see legitimate rule frameworks emerging. Again, it's going to be about, I think, 2 things. The first is there will be opportunities, and there's a huge silver lining in this scenario, as I mentioned, around the governance issue. That's going to spawn an entirely new industry. Just the capacity building that's going to be required to produce these new compliance regimes, and to produce the traceability that I was talking about, and to be able to enforce that good governance. That's going to be a combination of the servicification of global value chains in many different ways. We're going to see the new technologies being put into play to achieve transparency, traceability, whether it's tiny microscopic RFID tags to trace origins of technology and how they're being used and end use, or whether it's the use of AI and algorithms, and to be able to take data and determine whether risk levels, and whether it's cybersecurity. All of these things form challenges, but they form fantastic opportunities around these restructuring of value chains and these new sort of emergence of ecosystems and groupings.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, well, look, Alex, thanks very much. We look forward to that paper, and I think we're due for that maybe at the end of this month. But prior to that, please do go to our website, heinrichfoundation.com, where you'll be able to find Alex's latest paper on techno-nationalism and diplomacy. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Andy.